Okinawa is a fascinating place. It is mixed of all kinds of culture, from China, Japan, America, Korea, as well as its own culture, the Ryukyu-Okoku, the original name of Okinawa before it was annexed by Japan. Now, Okinawa is nothing like Japan in many ways, nothing like China, Korea, or America. It really has its own unique culture, but is also very good at mixing other cultures within its own. And in this video, I'm going to explain that very culture and how it's related to the Aquarians. Okinawa is a very harsh island. It's very difficult to live there. It's very hot. However, it is full of some of the most amazing spirits you could possibly come across, if you know where to look. It also has some of the darkest and most horrifying history one could imagine. But in this video, I'm going to focus on the positive side. After arriving in Okinawa, the first place that I went to is the place called Seifu Utake. Seifu Utake is one of the most sacred places in Okinawa because it is the prayer spot for the Yuta-san. And the Yuta-san are like the Miko-san or the Celtic witches. They are all female channelers. Their practices are very similar to my Celtic ancestors. They can talk to the dead. They are all women. And they use water during their initiation of new members, which of course is a very Aquarian symbol. This stone you see here is where they gather to see the sun rise in the east. Also very similar to something you might find in Celtic practices or culture. It overlooks the birthplace of the gods of Okinawa, Kutakajima, well known for its many cats located on the island. When I went there, I could channel with one of the ancestors almost immediately. She was a very kind, very loving being, as all Aquarians are. Immediately pulled off some of the negative energy within my psyche and soul. And she pointed out some of the things that they practiced in Okinawa hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And in this video here, you can see where they collected water to put on the forehead of their new initiates. Channeling was one of their main powers, and here in this castle, they would gather to pray and give information to the king at that time. This was also true of the Druids and the witches of the Celtic culture as well. Channelers of the dead would often be collected and kept near the king of that time. So I went to Kutakajima the following day, and lo and behold, came across what is known as a Kijimuna, one of the very playful fairies of Okinawa. The Kijimuna has a fascinating history within Okinawa, and many people have seen them or heard them. They live in these trees. These trees are amazing. They entangle and twist and turn throughout all of the jungle part of Okinawa. And if you're sensitive enough, you can pick them up. They can play tricks on you, but they tend to keep to themselves as they are rather playful, happy-go-lucky beings. They don't interfere with humanity, but are occasionally curious about humans and their behavior. Like other fairies in the Celtic mythology, the city folk, or the Shi, as they're sometimes called, the gentry, they sometimes interact with humans, but only on rare occasions. So on the first, second, and third day, I basically did a lot of walking on the areas a Yuta-san would probably travel. The prayer spots, a castle, the rock you see here, Seifu Utake, and Kutakajima, where the Yuta-san or nuns would gather to do all kinds of prayers or initiations or whatever. The exact details of those practices seem to be somewhat of a mystery. So in part 2, I'm going to look at some of those mysteries and find out what they were all about. So once again, I left the mainland Japan, traveled to Okinawa, got to Okinawa, trained hard in martial arts, mostly Okinawa Kobudo, particularly the staff because I like the staff, and traveled everywhere either by bus or by bicycle to investigate a little bit more about the Yuta-san, or sometimes called the Noro. And this time I went back to Seifu Utake, but I also went to some of the other grave sites or practice sites, ceremonial practice sites, where the Noro, which are different from the Yuta, but have similar practices. More on that later. The first place I went to was Seifu Utake, and this time I was very disappointed because it was overrun by people, mostly women, who thought they knew everything about being a Yutan. And I could tell by the atmosphere that the cult-like environment had invaded that place. It's become quite a tourist trap, so it's not worth going to anymore. The ones that are less touristy are much more interesting. And again, Seifu Utake overlooks Kudakajima, where the goddess Amima Kyo, a female goddess that came down to that island and started the culture of the Yuta and the Noro all over again. Because there's evidence that there was a great catastrophe that restarted the world history. And my suspicion is that Amima Kyo was one of the first people to come to Okinawa to restart that culture there. More on that later as well. But the way Seifu Utake has become like any other religion, it's overrun by commercialism, by people who think that they know. And when I was channeling with the ancestors there, they were explaining to me the truth of what the women at Seifu Utake were telling me. So both had information that was useful, but the women that were at Seifu Utake didn't know the real meaning of what it meant to be a Yuta-san or a Noro. They only knew the general information that came with their training, which was very unfortunate and disappointing. But that's always the case in the Matrix. You take one wonderful culture or religion, and they'll water it down to something that is only a shadow of what it once was. So as I was going through these different locations of the tombs of the Noro and the Yuta, the places that they practice and why they practice things the way they did, I did uncover some of their mysteries. Now, it's become more and more evident that the history that we're taught is completely inaccurate to what really happened. Recently, some Roman coins were found in an Okinawan castle. Now, why were Roman coins found in an Okinawan castle? Well, that would indicate that the Roman Empire traveled much farther than history had claimed that they had. Also, I found that the culture is, like I said in part 1, is not so different than some of the Celtic culture. The Shisa, for example, is a being that wards off ghosts or evil, while it allows the ancestors to come visit the people during the Esadori dance. That is not so different from Halloween. If you look at that Halloween, the pumpkins, originally they were turnips, were carved with faces with candles in it as well to ward off evil and allow the ancestors to come and dance and play. There are other things that were similar. The story of Urashima Taro is about a boy who gets on a turtle because he saved its life from some bullies, goes into another dimension, a world, where he finds that people don't age, people have wonderful foods, etc., comes back to his homeland only to age 400 years. That's not so different from the Ocean and Niev story or the Rip Van Winkle story. And on it goes. My suspicion is that the Celtic ancestors knew of the Okinawan ancestors and probably were friends. In the days of Atlantis, Mu, and the Tartarian empires that were supposedly on this planet before the Great Catastrophe, and the angels of the Matrix took over this world in order to fashion it after their way of doing things. That you can see in more detail in another video. So getting back to the Nora. The Nora were the channelers, or very much like the Druids or the higher witches in, and I'm of course talking about the white witches, in the Celtic mythology, and they worked for the kings. And the Druids used to do the same thing. They used to channel information from the gods or from the higher beings to tell the kings on what may or may not happen, etc., etc. The Yuta-san were the ones that were not working for the king. They were for within the community, and they could do the same thing. They could channel with their ancestors for information for the people so they can bring them health, peace, prosperity, not so different from the Celtic witches. Now, this time I did channel with one of the Yuta-sons. They're very loving, gentle beings. They work with the female energy. And they do allow men. This is what the people at Seifu Watake and the present Yuta-san don't really realize, is that they do allow men within their groups, but it's very rare. I would say about 95% of all of the Aquarian Yuta-san and witches are female, but occasionally they will find men who are strong enough or loving enough or empathic enough to understand the female energy while keeping their own masculinity. The ancestor there pointed out that this was very important because if you play with only the female energy, that could actually stop or stagnate your spiritual growth. So they did need these men, but they could not use these violent male egotists or these other men that were abusive to the female energy, so they were rejected, of course. Their love-making techniques were very soft and gentle and very, very nourishing. This was very important. They taught all the other people of their group how to do this, to nurture, to love, to expand on sex and sexuality, not to deny it. And again, they were only allowed to work with other women, but occasionally would allow men that were strong enough or loving enough or empathic enough to work with them. It's an experience that is very difficult to explain within the world we have today. But once you do experience it, you begin to realize that most of the lovemaking within this world is pretty barbaric in comparison. Unfortunately so. But again, because the world as it is now is mostly practicing things like lust and very other issues that are revolving around the destruction of humanity as opposed to the nurturing side of humanity. But in any case, the experience was once again very interesting. I can't narrow down every historical detail, which is kind of frustrating. But I could get the general idea on what they practiced and why they practiced it the way that they did, and who they chose to allow in their group. In the old days, they were very, very careful who they allowed in. You had to be willing to let go of all of the egos of the matrix. You had to be willing to become more loving, more compassionate, more nurturing than what you see in most of humanity today. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist even today. It's just very, very hard to find. And then once again, I was fortunate and lucky enough to be introduced to people who were willing to learn that path or had mastered it. And I noticed that though they are much like the Buddhists in some ways, or some of the Celtic gods in some ways, and some of the Olympian gods in some ways, they are unique in their culture and ways of doing things in many other ways. And that's what I found most fascinating about them above anything else. Well, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments section below. And thanks again for watching. Hope to see you in the next video. So to end this video, I'll play some Okinawa traditional flute music, and at the very end you can hear a comparison to Celtic flute music. I hope you found this informative. Thank you for watching.
Affleck!